And what did you make of Paul Keating's comments and continuing comments around this? Have you ever sought to brief him about the government's plans, or have you had interactions with him on the lead up to the announcement?
Look, I have, and obviously, you know, I have a high regard for Paul Keating, and I've been keen to keep him abreast of the thinking of the government and the direction in which we're going. Look, in terms of the capability that we need in the future, and making sure that it matches, if you like, the capability that has been there with the Collins class submarine, which you know, evolved during the Hawke-Keating years, and we saw the beginning of the commissioning of the Collins class in the late 90s through to the early 2000s. The Collins has been and continues to be on this day a long-range capable submarine. But the point is that as we go into the 2030s, it will be increasingly possible to detect a diesel-electric submarine while it recharges its batteries, while it snorts, is the term of art. And that's going to reduce the size of that question mark, because if you can track a diesel-electric submarine from the last moment at which it snorted, well, then you have a much closer sense of where it is. You can track it more closely. It's not as stealthy by definition. If we want the capability in the late 2030s that we had in 2005, indeed in 2000, then really the only path we can walk down is that of having a nuclear-powered submarine.
And all of this was explained to Mr Keating by you, I imagine, but he just didn't buy it.
Well, look, I mean, Paul has his own views, and that's fair enough.
When you spoke to him about it, did he straight up just say, "No, I don't buy this," or was he thinking about it at the time?
Oh, look, I think Paul's been pretty clear about his position on this, and you know, and I respect that and understand it. At the same time, the government has a very clear position of what we need to do so that we have, as I say, a capability in the 2030s which matches what we had in 2005, and indeed is a capability which is growing, and this is the only path that we can take if we want to do that.
So the government just has to live with his criticisms, really? You don't have much of a choice, do you?
Of course, and we get that, you know, there are going to be criticisms of others, and that's completely fair enough. We live in a free society, and we expect that. But we will continue to make our argument to the Australian people about why it's so important that we walk down this path. We need to have this capability. A cursory glance at our geography, an island nation with a huge trading connection to the world, a lot of which comes through sea lanes, obviously has to have the most significant maritime capability that we can have, and that lies in having a highly capable long-range submarine, and going forward that necessarily means a nuclear-powered submarine.
And when are we finally going to see this Defence Strategic Review? You haven't got long till budget.
Watch this space.
Well, can you tell us anything about it, and why has it been left until the last minute before the budget? I know it has to be declassified, etc. But
well, we've said all along that we will release this in April. We will release this in April, so it will be released imminently. And as you rightly say, there's been a bit of a job here in terms of declassifying the document that was provided to us by Sir Angus Houston and Stephen Smith. It's an incredibly important piece of work, because what it seeks to do is really restate Australia's strategic posture for the first time in well, more than 35 years. And we obviously live in a very different world today to the one that Paul Dibb was looking at when he wrote the Dibb Review back in 1985-86, which has really been the heart of our strategic posture since that time.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but then Indonesia was seen as potentially our main threat.
Well, Indonesia was seen differently then to what it is now.
Yeah.
I mean, we obviously see Indonesia as a very close friend today. Clearly, at that point in time, we were in the midst of the Cold War, and we've lived through the post-Cold War era. But we live in a very different world now, and part of the difference of that world is our relationship to it. Trade as a proportion of our economy today is far higher than it was in 1985. that means that we are much more reliant upon those sea lanes, which in turn means we're much more reliant upon the rules of the road, the global rules-based order. I mean, if you think about the South China Sea as an example of this, the majority of our trade goes through that body of water. That's what happens today. That body of water is now clearly central to Australia's national interest in a way that it wasn't back in 1985. And so all of that shapes the strategic landscape in which we exist, and therefore the strategic posture that we need to adopt. And what the DSR is going to do is articulate that posture in a kind of as a thesis, if you like, but then underneath that have a whole lot of recommendations around the shape of the Defence Force we need to give effect to that posture.
We've had some commentators and even politicians talk about almost an inevitability, and even US military people talk about almost an inevitability of a China-Taiwan conflict. Do you have some optimism that can be avoided?
I do, and I don't feel that that's inevitable. I mean, I think we are looking at great power contest in the world today, but we seek to engage with the world with our front line being our diplomacy, and through that what we seek to do is to create pathways for peace. And I think that that's a philosophy that the US brings to bear, and I hope China does as well. And I take some comfort from the meeting that happened between President Xi and President Biden at the end of last year, where they did look at guardrails in terms of the way in which their militaries interacted. And that's a positive step in terms of the two great powers trying to work through their issues, but in a way which has a pathway for peace. So I have a sense of optimism. But having said that, we live in a very complex and difficult world, and we need to be alive to that. And that implies a lot in terms of the kind of defence force that we need.
And just finally, the Defence Strategic Review. A lot of talk about more missiles, for example. Can we expect to see that? And in the budget then, we know we've got this increase from, say, 2.05 to 2.2% of GDP caused by AUKUS. Is there a further rise on top of that anticipated?
Well, again, we'll talk about that in the course of the announcing of the DSR and as we go forward. But we've made clear that the defence budget will grow, and that in many ways is a function of the strategic landscape in which we exist. In a rational world, defence spending is a function of strategic threat, strategic complexity. We have both of those, and we're rational people. In answer to your first question, I think as we think about what posture we need, projection is much more important for Australia today than it's been before. If we need to protect our connection to the world, and if we need to play our part in providing an underpinning of the global rules-based order, these are ideas and things which are well beyond our border. And so in that sense, we need to have a capacity to project, to make our contribution to the collective security of the region in which we live and the underpinning of the global rules-based order. That you will find is what underpins the kind of decisions that we're making in terms of the platforms that we have. And a nuclear-powered submarine is front and centre in terms of that concept.
Deputy Prime Minister, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Andrew.